Okay, welcome folks. Thanks Gavin for the introduction. So today is, as we know, is the 69th anniversary of the sad sinking and loss of the Princess Victoria on 31st of January 1953. So as the title slide says, 69 years on, I'm going to talk about a selection of 20 headstones. Judging by the chat there beforehand, people have got a lot of knowledge of the Princess Victoria and connections to the Princess Victoria, so please feel free to interject at the end of the talk and we'll have a wee bit of a chat. So it's hard to be selective, but I've gone for 20 headstones and tried to focus a little bit on those that are outside of Belfast, outside of Larne, but obviously I will be mentioning Larne on quite a few occasions. So there's quite a number of victims buried in Larne, particularly in the Greenland Cemetery in Larne. So those images there, that's just the gentleman to the left is Edmund Frail. He's buried in Dundonald. Then that's the image in the middle. Then is of the Princess Victoria in the state of capsize, and then to the right then is a memorial in to Jane Hannah in Carrick Victoria Cemetery. So a couple of books, particularly the one top left, Death in the North Channel, and that is kind of my Bible as such for the Princess Victoria disaster. That's done by the excellent Stephen Cameron. So Stephen has done a number of books, each of which I find equally fascinating, but particularly the Death in the North Channel one. So if you haven't got a copy of Stephen's book, I would thoroughly recommend. And then also another book, Last Message 1358, Death of the Princess Victoria by Bill Pollock. So just in terms of a bit of context before I get and I know I'm teaching my granny how to suck eggs here to a degree. A little bit of context to first launch into the, it's accidental pun to launch before I start talking about the Princess the 20 graves. So that's the ship herself, the vessel herself, and then this is her Achilles heel. This is the back of the ship. And this shows the guillotine doors. So basically the Princess Victoria, MV Princess Victoria was one of the first roll-on, roll-off ferries. And as I say, the back was the Achilles heel. So sadly, when she was launched on this particular evening, during the 31st of January 1953, the sea eventually breached the back doors and the guillotine doors, and it led to its foundering. So that's the image as well from the front cover of Stephen Cameron's excellent book. And as it says there in a little bit of information, it shows lifeboat number 4 containing women and children about to be dashed against the side of the ship. Numbers 2 and 6 lifeboats which survived are just to the rear of the Princess Victoria. One was actually obscured by that caption. So this is the route that the Princess Victoria tried to make. So to the right then is Stranraer, so it came up Loch Ryan, and then it was in atrocious weather conditions, and then it tried to set sail for Larne as planned, but then it drifted and it ended up, followed the arrows there, and then went down to where the X's were sunk, not far off the Copeland Islands. So that was part of the problem, that the lifeboats and other ships weren't clear exactly where the Princess Victoria was, so they were scrambled to a different area where they where she wasn't. So that was why there were so many fatalities. One of the reasons why there were so many fatalities. This is an article from 50 years ago, in other words, 19 years ago. sorry, it's on the 50th anniversary of the sinking, in other words, from 2003. And it commemorates it recognises the Princess Victoria disaster as the worst 20th century peacetime disaster in British waters. And then this is in the 60th anniversary, and in other words, 2013, and you'll see below the photographs there, it says not a single woman or child survived as the unseaworthy ferry floundered in icy seas. And there's a few images there as well. So so I started to notice a lot of fatalities commemorated in local cemeteries, and then this led to my interest in the Princess Victoria. So I'll rattle through 20 of them, and this is the first one, and this is in Larne Greenland Cemetery. And you'll see there, in loving memory of Roseanne, beloved daughter of Robert and Jeannie Baxter, who lost her life in the MV Princess Victoria disaster, 31st January 1953. And I have to thank Ricky Cole for that photograph. And this is Roseanne Baxter here. The photograph is taken out of the Stephen Cameron's book. And so Roseanne, who's buried in Larne Greenland Cemetery, was a 39-year-old stewardess from the town, and she'd been a wren during World War II before she started work on the cross-channel service, initially with the Princess Margaret, and then she was on the crew on the Princess Victoria. It said she was last seen on the ship's deck holding a baby in her arms. This is a relatively well-known photograph of Roseanne Baxter's funeral cortege heading up the hill to Larne Greenland Cemetery. So the second photograph then is over in God's own country. This is Dundonald, and that's the moat in the background, and that is this is in St. Elizabeth's graveyard in Dundonald. So you can see this headstone was erected by the parents in fond and loving memory of Lieutenant Commander Douglas A.N. Bilney, MBE-RN, Royal Navy of Kent, and his devoted wife Ruby Nee Milligan, who lost their lives in the Princess Victoria disaster January 31st, 1953, and were interred here. And the base of the headstone it says they were lovely and pleasant in their lives, and in death were not divided. So the Bilneys were travelling to take up posting at the Royal Naval Base of Eglinton outside Derry. Commander Bilney's body was washed up in Castletown on the Isle of Man several days later after the disaster, whilst Ruby's remains were recovered from the sea and brought to Belfast by SS Ballygowan. So Ruby's parents lived in Dundonald and Cherry Hill, I think. So this is why the Bilneys now lie in this scenic graveyard in the shadow of the ancient moat. What's the second one? The third one is also in Dundonald Cemetery. So you'll notice that a number of the headstones mention how the people died, but this one doesn't. So this doesn't even mention a date of death. But this, so you'll see it reads Child's in loving memory of Leslie, Joyce, and baby Stephen, and from their parents being Stephen's grandparents. I don't know if it's Leslie or Joyce's, or both, their parents. So they, three members of the Childs family who lost their lives in the disaster. Leslie was a chief petty officer in the Royal Navy, was travelling along with his wife Joyce and 3-year-old son Stephen to a new posting on the newly completed Harlanwood aircraft carrier HMS Centaur, which was due to be handed over to the Navy in September 1953. In other words, 9 months, well, 8 months after the disaster. So I did a tour yesterday in Dundonald Cemetery, a walking tour, and so we called it graves of people who died during January. And someone was asking why these guys are buried in Dundonald, because they were essentially an English couple. And I don't know the answer, but I do know from reading a press clipping that the neither neither family were able to travel over, but they had a friend who's the chief mourner at the funeral, and they lived in Ranfurly Drive, which is off the Belmont Road. So perhaps then they had some connection with Donald Cemetery, which meant that they got the plot there. So this is an article from the time, and you can see it that details a number, it details a number of fatalities and funeral arrangements for a lot of the victims. But the main title is Burial of Father, Mother and Child Who Died on Sea. So that's the child's. This is a very, very grainy photograph of their funeral service. So these are ratings from from the HMS Centaur, and so the funeral took place in St George's Church of Ireland in High Street in Belfast, and then the funeral services, then the cortege made its way with the 3 coffins to Dundonald Cemetery. So still in Dundonald Cemetery then, you'll see this is in loving memory of my devoted son, George Clark, who lost his life in the Princess Victoria disaster, 31st January 1953, aged 34 years. And at the base of the headstone, it says, "The wind and waves obey thy will." So George was living in Derby, and he was travelling home to visit his mother, Winifred, who lived at Hillsborough Parade off the Castlereagh Road. And George was planning to ask his mother to come over to Derby to live with him there. Winifred is also buried in the plot, and she died 14 years later in 1967 while still living at the same address, in other words, in Hillsborough Parade. I think those words, "the winds and the waves obey thy will," were quite hard, I would imagine, to put on the headstone, considering how George seemingly is Winifred's only son had died. So still in Dundonald Cemetery, but this is one of the things that interested me, was that quite a number of the victims are buried in Donald. So that is the Greenway, the Old Humber Belfast County Down Railway in the background. So that shows you that it's right at the very back of Dundonald Cemetery, and that commemorates Edmund Freel, engineer officer of MV Princess Victoria, lost his life at sea 31st January 1953, aged 29 years. Dearly loved husband of Nan Freel and darling daddy of Tricia and Kenneth. So this is Edmund here. He's a 4th engineer officer, and he lived at 3 Ashbrook Crescent and was aged 29, as I've heard, at the time, and married with a son and a daughter at the time of his death. He'd initially worked for Horn and Wolff before joining the Merchant Navy after World War II, and travelled widely. He decided to leave British Rail, who owned the MV Princess Victoria, to return to work in one of the Belfast shipyards, and heartbreakingly for his wife and young family, was only working an additional weekend shift to get extra money to buy tools before his return to the yard. And there was further heartbreak for his family when his body was recovered from this lifeboat that was washed up at Kearney Point. So both Edmund's body and this lifeboat were found at Kearney Point. The next one then is down to Ballyhalbert, and I only found this one relatively recently. It's hard to see, but at the bottom of the headstone, it says, "Inscribed by Margaret Gowan, in memory of her husband William, lost on board Princess Victoria, 31st January 1953, aged 26 years." And this is a press clipping which has William's photograph in it, and you can see that again he's the main story in this, and he's described in this article as among the last to leave the ship. So he was a crew member. He was a carpenter on the Princess Victoria, and he was from Portavogie. He was married with a 4-week-old son called Billy. He trained at Harlem Wolf, and then he went to sea in 1946, and he travelled as far as the West Indies on occasions. In 1951, he was shipwrecked on board the Paris City off the coast of Spain, and he was a bit like Edmund Friel. William was also to leave the employment of British Rail, in other words, get off the Princess Victoria, and he was also going back to the shipyard, due to go back in February 1953. So there's uncanny parallels with him and Edmund Friel. The day before, he had been round to see his mum and his sister, who lived at Derwent Street, so that's off D Street. Ironically, one of the streets is named after rivers, so like the Dee and the Derwent, etc. That's William Cowan. The next one then is Carrick Victoria Cemetery, and this plaque has gone up on relatively recently on the final resting place, Jane Hannah. So this, in other words, by this time last year, maybe a couple of years ago, certainly, this grave, I think, was unmarked. And so Jane Hannah, I say this in Carrick, Victoria. She was a widow, and she was actively involved in the Carrick Fergus Women's Unionist Association, and she lived at Troopers Lane in Carrick. She had been to Glasgow to visit an aunt and had sent her daughter a letter asking her to pick her up from Carrick railway station on the 31st of January 53. Her daughter and children waited at the station, then only to learn of the disaster. So sadly, her mother never turned up. So Jane was a widow, but her husband had been was John, and he was the station master at Troopers Lane. So then Jane still lived at Troopers Lane in the house. And John had previously been married, and his first wife had died, and he was the John was in those days was the station master at Ardmore Station up in the northwest, and this is his first wife, Isabella, who's seated here. She died, and she's buried in Faughan Bridge, in other words, outside, not far from Eglinton. She died in not far from Drumahoe, and she died on the 13th of October 1920. And John himself then died, the station master, in other words, Jane's husband, died on the 13th of February 1942. The next one then is this one. This is again in Larne, Greenland. And again, thanks to Rachel for this photograph. This is Adam Hegarty, who died as a result of MV Princess Victoria disaster, 31st January 1953, aged 23 years. So this is a grainy photograph of Adam. He was a steward on the Princess Margaret, and then he transferred to the Princess Victoria. And he died along with his Scottish fiancée, Philomena McDowell. The couple were aged 23 and 19 respectively, and they planned to marry 2 months later. So Adam's headstone also commemorates further premature loss, with his brother also drowning in Gourock in Scotland in 1962, aged only 13. So that's Hegarty. Adam Hegarty. The next one is back into Dundonald again, and that is again the moat. So this is St. Elizabeth's in Dundonald, and that is the moat in Dundonald in the background. And I'm going to be talking about this grave to the left there. That's Dewhurst. So that's a closer up photograph of the headstone, and it commemorates this man, Frank Dewhurst. So he was a captain and adjutant of the 53rd AA Workshop Company, Remy, Royal Electrical Mechanical Engineers, and he lived at Cherry Hill Drive in Dundonald, and was aged 60 at the time of his death. As you can see, the name Dewhurst is the sole wording on this simple headstone. And the only reason why I know that this guy died as a result of the Princess Victoria disaster is that a relation of his went on a tour that I was leading in Belfast City Cemetery one time and happened to mention it. So again, you would get no clues from looking at that headstone of how Frank Dewhurst died. The next one is in the Donald Cemetery, and this Commonwealth War Grave-like headstone commemorates John Edwin Lowe, and he was a flight sergeant with the RAF. He was married with a young daughter and lived at Flush Green in Belfast, in other words, quite close to Ravenhill. He was aged 50 at the time of his death, and he'd served in the forces since the age of 16 and was travelling home to Belfast from Bedford. John's wife then later brought the first claim for damages to the Northern Ireland High Court for the loss of her husband during the disaster. The next one then is back over to Carrick Victoria Cemetery, and you can see there Samuel McReynolds died as a result of the Princess Victoria disaster in 1953. This is Samuel here. So Samuel Master McReynolds was a 37-year-old electrician. He was employed at the Short Brothers in Harlan factory at Wig Bay, in other words, outside Stranraer, and he'd worked there for almost 2 years. But he lived at Rosebrook in Carrickfergus with his wife and 8 children. So those 8 children lost their father as a result of the Princess Victoria foundering. So then this is the next one. This is over in Knockbreda Cemetery, over near what I will always refer to as Supermac, now Forest Side. And this is the Moors. So this urn on the final resting place of the Moors commemorates Hubert, Martha, and 8-year-old Victor, who all died during the disaster. Hubert and Martha both worked at Short Brothers in Harlan's factory at Wig Bay again, and that's where the two had first met following the death of Martha's first husband. The family were travelling home to Richardson Street in Belfast, and Martha's father originally came to Northern Ireland, ironically, to work as a coast guard. So that's the Moor plot in Knockbreda, as I say. Next one then is, and it must have been raining when I took this photograph. This is in Glenarm, and this commemorates James Arthur Morrow. It's hard to look at this one because it's very blurry, but so he's commemorated. He lost his life in the MV Princess Victoria, aged 33 years. So he lived at Roddens Lane in Larne at the time of his death. So I say a number of the headstones don't give any clues to how the person died, but in this case there's nothing at all on the grave. This is an unmarked one. Sadly, it's not the only unmarked grave of a Princess Victoria disaster victim, but it's the only one I'll mention tonight. And this is over in Dundonald Cemetery again, and this commemorates Thomas Morton Jr. He again was an employee of the Short Brothers in Harlan factory at Wig Bay and was travelling home to his house at 153 Ainsworth Avenue in Belfast. He was aged 27 and was married with 1 daughter at the time of his death. So the only reason why I know that he's buried there is that you're able to look up the records online in the Belfast City Council website, and then to try to find the grave, then there's a headstone either side there, so you can find check the reference of the two the guys buried either side of the grave, and so that's how you know that it's definitely not grave. But sadly, as I say, it's unmarked. The next guy is actually commemorated in 2 locations, and I don't think he's buried in either. I'm not sure his body was ever recovered. This is down in Blaris Cemetery outside Lisburn, and you'll see there, but halfway down, William is commemorated a beloved husband, William Nassau Parker, 25th April 1903 to 31st January 1953, lost Princess Victoria. In this particular section of the cemetery didn't open until after the disaster, a number of years after the disaster. So, and you can see his wife only passed away in 1953, in other words, sorry, 1993, in other words, 40 years after her husband. These also commemorated in over at Knockbreda Cemetery. You can see there, this is his parents' grave, and commemorates their son, William Nassau Parker, lost Princess Victoria disaster, 31st January 1953. So again, he worked as a fitter at Short and Harlan's Wigby factory and was living at Ava Street in Belfast at the time of his death. So the only burial in this headstone in Blaris is his wife, who died 40 years after her husband. So that one's in Knockbreda. The next one then is over to Carrick, Victoria, and you'll see about the middle there commemorates his son Wolsey William Patterson, lost his life in MV Princess Victoria 31st January 1953. So Wolsey married his wife Davina, who was originally from Edinburgh, in 1952, and they lived in West Street in Carrick. Wolsey William Patterson had served with the RAF, and after he was demobbed, was employed by the Short brothers in Harlan factory at their Belfast factory before transferring to their Wigby factory. It's thought that Wolsey was to bring Davina on the trip with him, but changed his mind at the last minute. So also buried in this grave are Wolsey's parents and brother, Henry Thomas Patterson, who died on 8th October 1993, but not Davina. So that suggests to me anyway that she might have returned to Scotland after her husband's sad death. This is an image of William here. Oh, sorry, Wolsey William here to the left, and then this is a sketch of him that is in one of my book about my 2020 book, and it's about 20 graves in each of 20 different local cemeteries, and one of the cemeteries to feature is Carrick, Victoria. So that's why that image of that sketch of Wolsey is in that book. This is over again to Knockbreda. I'm giving the people from Larne a bad stare here. I've only mentioned Larne a couple of times, but this is Knockbreda, and it commemorates Spence and Lennox Piggott, 31st January 1953. So again, from that headstone, you wouldn't guess that, you wouldn't think that it was necessarily from the Princess Victoria disaster, but this is the Piggott brothers who did die as a result of the Princess Victoria disaster. So they both worked for their dad, who was the chairman of the English bakery in Belfast. In other words, where on Newton Ards Road at Collinswater, where Wise Buys is now. And they were returning home from a business trip. They were originally supposed to, they were over for an exhibition in London. They were originally supposed to fly back, but because the weather was so bad, and this is the case for a number of the passengers, they then got the train up to Stranraer so they could get back using the ferry. Sadly, they both died. Both went down with the ship. Spence, who's to your left, was 28 at the time of his death, and Lennox, to your right, was 19. The brothers lived together in Osborne Gardens, in other words, off the Malone Road in Belfast. And there's a plaque on this formerly the English bakery, and now say Wise Buys, but you'll see in the second half, the lower section, it says the first manager Tom Piggott went down with his sons and Princess Victoria. So that's actually wrong, because Tom, the father, wasn't even on the ship, but he died, as you can see, as you might have noticed from the headstone there previously, 4 years after his two sons. So it just says a little bit more about the English bakery and the Bloomfield bakery. It was a factory that made cream crackers and marshmallows. My granda, of course, not of course, but my granda worked in a biscuit factory, Scribbins Kemp, on the Springfield Road, and never ate fig rolls. So maybe my mum will add that about that later on, why he never ate fig rolls. This is over in Carnmoney for the first time this evening, and there's only 2 more to go after this one. And this commemorates Adam McCann Reid. And as you can see there, he was drowned from the MV Princess Victoria, 31st January 1953. He was married with a teenage daughter and was living at Armitage Street in Belfast. And he was another employee at the Short Brothers and Harlan factory at White Bay. He was a labourer. His body was recovered by MV Freedor in the early days of February 1953 and was brought ashore at Londonderry. So just shows you that he didn't drift up to Derry, but that's where his body was landed. So the penultimate headstone is over to Drumbeg Cemetery. In other words, the top of the Malone Road, where that past Lady Dixon Park, where they have that nice slitchgate to the church. This commemorates John Maynard Sinclair, and that's the sketch of him from the 2020 book. He was 57 years old, and he was Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance in the Northern Ireland government. He reputedly helped women and children up to the boat deck, an ultimately fruitless task, as mentioned earlier, and all women and children perished, as sadly did Major Sinclair. On hearing of his loss, his mother-in-law died, presumably of a heart attack, adding further trauma to the family. The Maynard Sinclair Pavilion at Stormont is a tangible reminder of the esteem that Major Sinclair was held in. Whilst there's also a children's ward at the Ulster Hospital is named in his honour, as is the Major J.M. Sinclair Memorial Pipe Band. So he was quite highly thought of. And the final one then is this is in Belfast City Cemetery. I think it's the first one I've mentioned in Belfast City Cemetery, and it's very close-up photographs. It's quite hard to read. Remember, it's Lieutenant Colonel Sir Walter Dorling Smiles, and amongst the letters there are DSO, Distinguished Service Order, and MP. Lost at sea in the Princess Victoria disaster, 31st January 1953, age 69. So he was an MP for North Down at the time of his death, and he had received 2 Distinguished Service Orders during the Great War, and was recommended apparently for a VC and one Victoria Cross on one occasion. It is said that if the weather had been better, Walter would have been able to see his home at Orlock outside between Groomsport and Donegal from the ship as she sank off the Copeland Islands. And Walter was the first managing director of the Belfast Rope Works at Connswater. So also commemorated on that headstone are 2 of Walter Dorling Smiles' brothers, who both died during the Great War. And each of those 3 brothers were great uncles of the explorer Bear Grylls. That's the last of the 20. Oh no, sorry, that's Maynard Sinclair then. In other words, the previous person there, and Walter Dorling Smiles to the right. So the 2 most prominent victims of the Princess Victoria disaster. Some say, there's some thought that one of the main reasons why the Princess Victoria sailed in such bad weather conditions was that firstly it had to get the mail over to Northern Ireland. That's the main way that the mail travelled over in those days. Secondly, there's a school of thought that says that one of the other reasons was that they had to get these 2 very important men over As I say, Maynard Sinclair was Deputy Prime Minister at the time. And it's said that I read relatively recently that Maynard Sinclair was last seen jumping into the water and saying, "My name is Sinclair," as he hit the water. So I don't know why he did that, but that's one school of thought says that's where he was last sighted. So this is another headstone. This commemorates a survivor of the Princess Victoria disaster. As you'll see there, Alexander William Brodie died 27th March 2008. Now, again, this is in Larne, Greenland Cemetery, and he's commemorated here as survivor of the Princess Victoria disaster in 1953. So he died 55 years after the disaster, but he's still commemorated as a survivor of the Princess Victoria disaster. So speaking of survivors, it's a great photograph there of a survivor getting some much needed first aid from a nurse there, presumably in hospital or in one of the hotels. Some in Donegal, for example, took in survivors. You wouldn't get that nowadays with health and safety, quite rightly. And then another one which became another plaque, sorry, that I became aware of only this evening. So the churchyard to the right is St. Guire, and I hope I've pronounced that right, Tuaire, Rakadui. And then this commemorates, in there are the ashes of Albert Dickey, and he again was a survivor of the Princess Victoria disaster. He died in 2007, aged 80, and the plaque to the left then, that's at the Rakadui War Memorial, and it commemorates his war service during the Second World War. But it also at the base says also survivor of the Princess Victoria disaster in 1953. Sorry, I meant to say about Craig. Sorry, Craig is when the sea breached the rear stern doors of the Princess Victoria, able seaman Alex heroically had a rope tied around him and tried to close the door, but with no success. He was later thrown into the water as the ship capsized, swimming to safety of a nearby lifeboat, number 6. So my thanks to Linda Heffron for giving me those photographs as well. It's Albert's daughter. So there's a number of commemorations of the Princess Victoria disaster. They only went up quite a number of years after the disaster. So there's one in Stranraer, which was relocated relatively recently. But this one then is in Larne, and that's the tower at name escapes me, down at the seafront at Larne, near the leisure centre. And then this is in Donegal on the pier. There's a plaque here to commemorate the heroic services provided by the Sir Samuel Kelly lifeboat, rescuing a lot of the survivors. And then this is Ardeen has previously forwarded this. This is a letter that was sent over to her family, and it eventually made it, but it was on the Princess Victoria disaster. So you can see it was. It says there top left, salvage from MV Princess Victoria, and then there's a stamp on it saying damaged by seawater. So this is your suffering is now ended. Of course, it's traditional that I shamelessly plug a book at the end of my talks. So this is my latest book, due out next week. Well, certainly next month. And this is about Roselawn Cemetery. So this is my 4th book, and that is my gran and granda on their wedding day. And then on the back cover is their grave, their headstone, sorry, at a photo of their headstone at Roselawn. So say that book should be out within sometime next month. That's all, folks. Thanks very much for tuning in.